All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Our listeners, you love to really get into the weeds on some of these really complicated topics, much like a philosopher just loves to unpack all those layers and nuances of a really good argument. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're diving headfirst into this really interesting relationship between moral theory and bioethics. And, on the surface, it might seem pretty straightforward, but trust me, there's a lot more going on here. And as we'll see, things can get pretty complicated.
Absolutely. You've definitely picked a topic that's, well, it's a bit of a philosophical minefield, you could say, but a really fascinating one. So our guide for this journey is the Theory and Bioethics entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's like a one-stop shop for different perspectives on this whole thing, really comprehensive. And, our mission here, it's not just about definitions, it's about digging deeper. We want to explore whether moral theory is like the bedrock of bioethics, or maybe just a useful tool, sometimes helpful, sometimes not, or maybe even, a bit of an obstacle in some situations. We're going to uncover some really cool disagreements and how these ideas have changed over time. It's the kind of stuff that really gets those philosophical gears turning.
So, okay, let's start with the basics. It kind of seems obvious that, well, moral theory would be the basis for bioethics, right?
Mhm.
But as our source points out, neither of these things, moral theory or bioethics, is really that simple. We're not dealing with like one single idea here.
Yeah, that's a really important point to clarify right from the start, especially for, our listeners, folks who are already thinking about these things. When we say moral theory, we're not just talking about utilitarianism,
Yeah.
right? Like you do whatever leads to the best outcome for the most people, or deontology, where you've got your duties and rules you have to follow. It's much broader than that.
Well,
Our source talks about how Martha Nussbaum, she has these criteria for what makes a moral theory a theory. They should make recommendations, check if our beliefs are right, be organized and kind of work at a high level, aim to apply to everyone, and be clearly stated. But even stuff that doesn't quite fit all those like moral particularism, where the specifics of each situation really matter, those are still considered theories. It's even about how a philosopher argues, their tone, their style, it all plays a part.
and bioethics, well, that's not just one thing either.
Right.
It's not just these abstract discussions in, ivory towers.
Right, exactly.
It's about real life stuff, policy decisions about healthcare and what doctors should actually do when they're with a patient.
Exactly. It's not just theory, it's happening out there in the world. And so the role of moral theory, well, it's probably going to be different depending on which part of bioethics you're looking at.
Yeah, that makes sense. So our source really emphasizes that this whole relationship between theory and bioethics, it's mostly debated in academic bioethics, the kind of stuff you talk about in philosophy departments. But when it comes to making policies or dealing with patients, well, practicality takes over, right?
Definitely. And for a good while, the main approach was this idea of applied ethics. It seemed pretty intuitive. You take those big moral theories, your Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and you just apply those principles to whatever ethical problems come up in medicine or biology. It's like, here's a theory, let's plug it in and get our answers.
So basically plug and play ethics.
Pretty much. But, as with most things that seem simple, it turned out to be a lot more complicated. People started pointing out some serious problems, and some of these criticisms, they really get to the heart of what philosophy is all about. For example, there's Arthur Caplan. He made some really good points. He said, look, a lot of times these big theories, they don't have specific answers for the really tough medical problems. And then there's the fact that people don't even agree on what the ethical problem is in a given situation. Like how you even describe the problem can be up for debate.
Right.
And then Kaplan also pointed out, kind of cheekily, that philosophers, they're not exactly doctors, right? They can't just walk into a hospital and magically solve everything. The reality of medicine is messy, and it doesn't always fit neatly into theoretical boxes. But I think his most important point, and the one that really speaks to the heart of philosophy, is that this applied model, it assumes that theory just dictates practice. It's a one-way street. But what about the insights that come from actually dealing with those real-life problems? Shouldn't that inform and refine our theories?
That's a really good point about, which way the knowledge is flowing. And our source then brings up Beauchamp and McIntyre. And they actually question this whole separation between theory and application.
Right, exactly.
Like, is it really that clear-cut?
Exactly. Beauchamp, he argued that philosophers, whether they're working on those big abstract theories or on applied issues, they're basically doing the same things. Analyzing concepts, trying to justify their beliefs, putting together arguments, it's all philosophy. And he said, well, ethical knowledge, it goes both ways. Theory can help us understand real-life dilemmas, and those dilemmas, they can make us rethink and improve our theories. Then McIntyre, he added this really insightful point about rules. He said, look, just because people disagree about the abstract rules, it doesn't mean they're going to disagree about what to do in a specific situation. You can have people with totally different moral beliefs who still agree on the right course of action. That suggests that maybe we don't always figure out the rules first and then apply them. Maybe figuring out what to do in a specific case. That actually helps us understand the rules better.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's like when we try to apply a rule, that process can actually give us feedback, refine our understanding of the rule itself. And then there's this story about Toolman, being on this national commission. And he saw something really striking. He saw people with totally different theoretical viewpoints, but they were still able to reach a consensus on some really tough bioethical issues.
Right. And that led him to this whole idea about the tyranny of principles. He was basically saying maybe these big abstract theories, they're not the main reason why people agree on ethical issues in the real world. Maybe it's more about shared values or just trying to find solutions that work.
Right.
It makes you wonder, if you can have agreement without everyone buying into the same big theory, then how much influence do those theories really have?
That's a really good question. And this whole idea of reflective equilibrium, it sort of fits in here, right? Like
Yeah.
you're constantly adjusting your principles and your judgments about specific cases until you reach a point where everything kind of makes sense together.
Yeah, exactly. Reflective equilibrium, it's this back and forth process, right? You're not just starting with theory and applying it blindly. Your intuitions about specific cases can actually challenge your principles, and your principles can help you make sense of your intuitions. It's this ongoing dialogue aimed at making your whole moral outlook more consistent and justified. It's a really dynamic process.
So given all these problems with just applying theories, bioethics initially turned to these high moral theories, the big names like Kantianism and utilitarianism, for more guidance. I guess the idea was to bring in these really powerful philosophical frameworks to tackle those really tough bioethical problems. What made that so appealing?
Well, you can see the appeal, right? Especially if you're a philosopher who's all about rigor and justification. These grand theories, they offered a really structured way to think about ethics. They promised a systematic way to justify your decisions and make sure you're being consistent. You could look at someone like Donegan, who used Kantian ideas about respecting people to ground the concept of informed consent. Or Engelhardt, who had this libertarian approach to healthcare ethics, all based on individual rights. Or Fletcher, who used utilitarianism to figure out what will create the most well-being in all sorts of bioethical dilemmas. These theories, they seem to provide a really solid foundation when you're facing new and challenging issues.
But then, this whole fascination with high theory in bioethics, it seemed to fade over time. What went wrong?
Well, a few things happened. First off, you've got the problem of just choosing which theory to use. Like, if you got all these different theories, how do you pick the right one for a specific case? And how do you justify that choice to someone who believes in a different theory? Even within one theory, like utilitarianism, you've got different versions, right? Like act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. And those can lead to different answers in real life situations. And then there's the issue of democracy and public understanding. These high theories can get really complicated, and it's hard to explain those justifications to people who aren't philosophers. And then from a practical standpoint, well, most clinical ethicists, they don't have PhDs in philosophy. It's tough for them to apply these complex theories in the real world of a hospital where things move fast. Sometimes the kind of comprehensive justification you get from high theory just isn't practical. And finally, there's the example of Norman Daniels trying to apply Rawls' theory of justice to healthcare allocation. It showed that these big theories can be too abstract, too general. They don't always give you clear guidance for making specific policy decisions.
So basically, high theory, it had its moment in the bioethics spotlight, but it just wasn't practical enough for the messy reality of, life and death decisions.
Right.
So it seems like the bioethics folks, they started looking for something more down to earth, something more in the middle.
Yeah.
And that's where principlism comes in,
Right.
right? Béchamp and Childress, with their famous book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics.
Yeah.
That seemed like a pretty direct response to all the problems with using those big, abstract theories.
Exactly. They presented these 4 core principles: autonomy, beneficence, which means doing good for others; non-maleficence, which means avoiding harm; and justice. These principles, they gave people a shared language to talk about ethics, which was really important in a world where everyone has different moral viewpoints. And importantly, Beauchamp and Childress themselves, they came from different philosophical backgrounds. So it wasn't like you had to be a Kantian or a utilitarian or anything specific to accept these principles.
Right.
Now, at first, principlism seemed kind of deductive, like theory leads to principles, principles lead to rules, and rules lead to actions, but quickly evolved to focus more on this idea of reflective equilibrium. That meant acknowledging that those judgments we make about specific cases, they actually play a big role in shaping how we understand and use those principles. It's not a one-way street.
And then you've got this idea of a common morality that becomes really important, especially in the later versions of their book. It's like there's this set of basic moral ideas that pretty much everyone agrees on, regardless of their culture or philosophy. So how does this common morality fit in with reflective equilibrium?
It's like a combination of two approaches to justifying our moral beliefs. So reflective equilibrium is the coherentist part. That's where you're constantly tweaking your principles, your judgments about specific cases, your background theories to make everything fit together nicely. But the common morality, that adds a foundationalist element. It says, look, there are some fundamental moral norms that we all share, and these are the basis for those four principles. Beauchamp and Childress, they argue that this common morality, it's rooted in history, it's shown that it works for people over time, but they also say that these basic norms, they apply to everyone, everywhere.
Okay, so principlism, it's become pretty popular, right? But of course, it's had its share of critics, especially from a philosophical perspective. Some people argue that, well, its strength, the fact that it's easy to understand and appeals to a lot of people, that might also be a weakness. Like maybe it's not systematic enough, or maybe it can't really resolve those really tough ethical conflicts.
Yeah. Right. You hit the nail on the head there. One of the big criticisms is that it doesn't have a clear hierarchy or a foolproof way to resolve conflicts when those four principles clash. Like what happens when autonomy goes up against beneficence, for example. Critics like Gert and his colleagues, they argue that without a clear system for resolving those conflicts, principlism can feel a bit ad hoc, relying more on intuition than a rigorous decision-making process.
Right.
And then you have Macmillan, who suggests that focusing so much on principles, especially autonomy, might actually stifle deeper moral thinking. It can lead to this automatic preference for individual choice, even when other considerations might be more important. And then John Arris, he raises some really fundamental questions. He asks, is there really such a thing as a common morality that's separate from our own considered judgments? And does principlism really have its own distinct method, especially since it embraces wide reflective equilibrium, which means you can bring in other moral theories? It's like, if you're allowed to use other theories anyway, then what's so special about those four principles? It's also worth noting that early on, some people misunderstood principlism. They thought it was all about promoting American individualism and that it didn't care about virtues. But Beauchamp and Childress, they've pushed back against that, emphasizing that the principles aren't absolute and that virtues definitely have a place in their framework.
So it sounds like even principlism, which was supposed to be this more practical middle ground, it's still generating a lot of debate and discussion, especially among philosophers who like to, pick things apart and analyze them really carefully. And with all these issues around both high theory and principlism, bioethics has explored some other approaches. And one of those is casuistry, right? This focus on analyzing specific cases. That seems like a pretty direct reaction to the abstract nature of some of these principle-based approaches.
Yeah, exactly. Casuistry is all about starting with those concrete cases, those real-life dilemmas, rather than trying to apply abstract principles from the get-go.
Right.
It's about looking at similar cases from the past and seeing how they were resolved to get some guidance for the case at hand. You could say it's like building up ethical wisdom through experience, kind of like how judges rely on precedents in legal cases.
Wait.
Now, there are different flavors of casuistry. You've got moderate casuistry, where you still use principles to guide your analysis of the cases. And then there's radical casuistry, where the principles themselves are supposed to emerge from looking at a bunch of cases. It's like you're not starting with any preset principles, you're letting them emerge from the bottom up. People who like casuistry argue that it's a good way to find common ground in a world where everyone has different moral views. You focus on those specific situations, you find those shared understandings, and they also say it fits well with how people in healthcare think, very case-oriented. Plus, it's a good way to teach ethics because you can use real-life stories and dilemmas.
But relying mainly on cases, that raises some questions, or like, how do you know which past cases are actually relevant to a new situation? And who gets to decide which cases are the important ones? And if you don't have any principles to guide you, Aren't you just going to keep making the same mistakes or just end up following whatever biases already exist?
You're right. Those are some of the big worries people have about casuistry. There are concerns about who gets to choose those paradigm cases, the ones we use as our guideposts. And there's a worry that casuistry can be a bit too conservative, just reinforcing the status quo without pushing for any real change. And for those who like the radical version, it's not always clear how you can actually get any guidance if you don't start with at least some values or principles.
Makes sense. So then we've got narrative ethics, which is another alternative. That one really emphasizes context and personal stories and lived experiences. It's kind of like a pushback against those theory-driven approaches.
Exactly. Narrative ethics is saying, look, those moral principles, they're not just these universal rules that we figure out by thinking really hard in our heads. They're shaped by our life stories, the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are, our relationships, the things that have happened to us. To really understand the moral weight of a situation, you have to understand the stories behind it. And practicing narrative ethics means really engaging with those stories, reading them, telling them, comparing them, analyzing them, trying to figure out what they mean.
Interesting.
And there are different ways to think about narrative ethics. Some people see it as a way to complement those principle-based approaches. It's like
Uh-huh.
adding in those individual experiences and making that whole process of reflective equilibrium even richer. Others focus more on those big historical and cultural narratives, how those shape our moral understanding. And then there are those who think narrative ethics can completely replace those traditional ways of justifying our moral beliefs. They emphasize the importance of dialogue and listening to those voices that haven't always been heard.
But how exactly does reading a story or listening to someone's experience, how does that lead to making moral judgments or justifying our actions? That seems like a pretty crucial link, right?
And are all stories equally valuable or insightful?
You're asking the right questions. Critics of narrative ethics point out that it's not always clear how we go from stories to moral decisions. In that historical narrative approach, there's the problem of figuring out which historical stories are the right ones to focus on, and if they can really tell us what to do in today's world. And for those who say narrative can replace principles altogether, well, there's a worry that we might end up with moral relativism, where everything depends on your perspective and there's no real truth. And then there's the challenge of what to do when different stories lead to completely different moral conclusions.
So, lots to think about there with narrative ethics. It's definitely a different way of approaching things, but like all these approaches, it's got its strengths and weaknesses. And finally, our source talks about feminist theory and bioethics and how it brings a whole new set of ideas and concerns to the table. Right. Feminist bioethics is really about looking at the bigger picture, the social, political, and historical factors that shape our moral experiences. It's about paying attention to the lived experiences of women and other marginalized groups, those who haven't always had a seat at the table. And it challenges the idea of a neutral or universal common morality, arguing that a lot of times those common moralities actually reflect the views of those in power, the experts, and they might not take into account the experiences of everyone. It also uses this idea of standpoint theory, which basically says that where you stand in society, your social position, affects how you see the world. And feminist bioethics values those personal experiences, those lived realities, over abstract reasoning. Some of its key contributions have been pointing out those male-centered biases in bioethics and showing how concepts like reason versus emotion or public versus private, they're actually loaded with gendered meanings. You see the impact of feminist theory in all sorts of areas, like Sherwin's approach to abortion, where she emphasizes women's agency and their right to make decisions about their own bodies. And you see it in the different feminist perspectives on physician-assisted dying, where some emphasize a care-based approach, while others worry about the potential for women to be exploited or pressured into making those decisions. So while feminist theory is pretty diverse in its approaches, it's definitely had a huge impact on how we think about bioethics.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, moving on from those theoretical discussions, what about the real world? What role does moral theory actually play in the work of a clinical ethicist? Someone who's actually doing ethics consultations in a hospital.
That's where all this theory meets the nitty-gritty of patient care. And a lot of the discussion in clinical ethics focuses on the different models of consultation and whether moral theory has a place in them. The ASBH, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, they've got these guidelines that outline different models. There's the pure consensus model, which is all about mediating between different parties and doesn't really rely on any explicit moral theory. A lot of people think that model's a bit too weak philosophically speaking.
Right.
Then there's the authoritarian model, where the consultant basically tells everyone what to do, and any moral theory they're using is kind of hidden.
Hmm.
That one's seen as pretty ethically problematic because, well, who made the consultant the boss?
Right. Exactly.
And then there's the ethics facilitation model, which is the one they endorse. In this model, the consultant's job is to clarify what the ethical issues are, help everyone communicate better, and guide them towards a resolution that makes sense ethically. In this model, knowing about moral theory can be really helpful. It can help the consultant figure out what the moral dimensions of the case are and offer some options that are ethically sound. Now, being really well versed in moral theory can be a big asset for a clinical ethicist. It can help them put together arguments, consider different points of view, and be consistent in their reasoning. But there are also some potential downsides.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, leaning too heavily on abstract theory can sometimes stifle creativity and those gut instincts that can be so important in complex situations. There's also the temptation to cherry pick theories to support the outcome you already want, or to misinterpret a situation by forcing it into a theoretical framework that doesn't quite fit. And then there's the risk of just plain misapplying a theory if you don't really understand all its nuances.
Right. That makes sense. So it sounds like in the clinical setting, it's better to have a practical understanding of moral theory, kind of like a toolkit you can use to analyze and communicate. You're not trying to rigidly apply any one grand theory. You're more focused on helping people make good decisions in a way that respects everyone's values and perspectives.
Exactly. The main takeaway here is that moral theory can be a really useful resource for clinical ethics consultation, but it's not a substitute for really listening to people, understanding the details of the case, and having those good communication skills.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that this relationship between moral theory and bioethics, it's not simple. It's always evolving, always being debated. And whether you see moral theory as this essential foundation, or a useful but limited tool, or even sometimes a hindrance, it all depends on the context. Are you talking about academic philosophy, policy decisions, or what's happening at the bedside? And as we discussed at the very beginning, it even depends on what you mean by moral theory in the first place. And you pointed out that this whole separation between theory and practice, well, that's still being debated by philosophers.
Absolutely. It's hard to imagine bioethics existing without some kind of moral framework, some underlying assumptions about right and wrong. But how we use moral theory in bioethics, that's a complex issue. It depends on the situation, and it requires us to constantly reflect and critique our own approaches.
For sure. And for our listeners, you folks who really like to grapple with these complex issues, understanding the theories behind bioethics is essential. It's how you can really participate in those crucial conversations that are shaping our world, especially as technology keeps advancing and things keep getting more complicated.
Great. And this deep dive should get you thinking about which approaches you find most convincing and why. Maybe it'll even inspire you to check out some of the philosophers we mentioned, like Beauchamp, Childress, Arras, Nussbaum, MacIntyre. Read their work, see what they have to say. It's all part of this ongoing conversation about how we make ethical decisions in a world that's changing faster than ever.
Exactly. So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.